All right, we're right at 6:30, so we're going to get started. People might start trickling in. That's okay. But welcome everyone. My name is Natalie Schilling. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Associate at Awake, Tennessee, and we are joined by Sloane Crockett. She is the founder of Portrait of a Prisoner. She went to school with me at Belmont University for social work. There, when she was in school, she worked with individuals on Tennessee's death row, as well as worked on some federal cases as an intern. And she just finished her first year of law school, so we're really proud of her. Her dream is to be an attorney for death row inmates, so she knows this issue through and through. So, everyone, thank you so much. Sloane, let's get on started. So, I'm kicking us off with some basic definitions and just reminding there's a Q&A function. So, feel free if you ever have any questions or you want us to explain something further, please throw that in the Q&A function and we'll get that started. So, starting off with the death penalty, you might have heard of capital punishment. So, that is the same thing as the death penalty. That is the process of sentencing convicted offenders to death for the most serious crimes and the carrying out of that sentence. So, you'll often hear the death penalty and capital punishment used interchangeably. Similarly, death row, you've probably heard of that one. That describes the circumstances where incarcerated persons who have been sentenced to death are awaiting execution. So those folks that have been sentenced to death, but not yet actually got put to death, they're waiting on death row. One more term that's really important is capital clemency. So that is when a governor or like president, person in power, pardons an individual death row inmate and commutes their sentences. So to commute your sentence, you either shorten it, you just take them from death to life without parole, that kind of thing. So that's a power that decision makers can have. Couple more. A moratorium, that is a temporary suspension of executions. So that will happen and it's just provisional and it depends on that key decision maker. They might do it for moral reasons. They might do it because there's issues with the process, as we've seen in Tennessee. So that is just like a pause on executions. It's not a complete suspension of them forever. It's just like a pause. Aggravating circumstances are factors. Those are factors that increase the severity or culpability of a criminal act. So that might take something from just like a felony to a felony that's eligible for the death penalty if it's aggravated circumstances. We'll see some examples of those later. And then appeal. So this is the several opportunities that there is for the defendant to raise errors that might have happened at trial and try to attempt to commute their sentence down from a death penalty to just life in prison without parole. I was going to go through all those appeals, but you guys got saved due to time today, but just know that process is long, and that's often why folks sit on death row for 20, 25 years is because they have the option to keep appealing. All right, so quick, brief history of the death penalty. In the United States, just in the 21st century, we've seen that 23 states and DC have abolished the death penalty altogether. So in that graph, they're the blue colors. There have been moratoriums in place in California since 2019, Pennsylvania since 2015, and Oregon since 2011. So you'll see those are the orange states on this map. Virginia actually became the most recent and first Southern state to abolish the death penalty, and that was in 2021. So they're hopefully leading the way for others to join. As of right now, as you can see, it's almost all Northern and like California, Oregon, those types of states. Into Tennessee specifically, we're going to go a little bit more in depth into this history. So actually in 1915, this Tennessee state legislature abolished the death penalty for murder, but that bill was actually vetoed by the governor. But the ban still went in effect because there was a delayed veto. Not going to go into that whole process, but it still went into effect despite the state legislature abolishing the death penalty. So like they were able to abolish the death penalty temporarily. And then in 1919, Tennessee reinstated the death penalty. We've had it ever since. In 1965, there was another bill to abolish the death penalty in Tennessee that failed by one single vote. So that's why advocacy matters. If someone had just called that person and convinced them to flip, we might not have had the death penalty today. So important to note. And then in 1972, there was a landmark Supreme Court case ruling in Furman v. Georgia that ended up voiding 40 death penalty statutes and commuted the sentences of 629 death row inmates around the country. Due to that Supreme Court case ruling, a lot of states had to rewrite their statutes. So that was 35 states, including Tennessee, had to enact entirely new death penalty statutes to conform to that Furman v. Georgia ruling. I'm double checking that we don't have any Q&As. Okay. So a little bit more into the Tennessee death penalty history going into the 21st century. Kind of the big through line here is that historically Tennessee has had systemic issues with its lethal injection protocol. So in Tennessee, we primarily use the lethal injection. You might have seen other methods of a death penalty. We primarily use lethal injection, but there's been a lot of issues with that. So first kind of known marker was in 2007. There was an executive moratorium. So the governor put a pause on them for 90 days while the state examined its lethal injection protocol. After that, in 2014, Governor Haslam signed a forced electrocution bill that would allow people to use the electric chair when the lethal injection drugs were not available. So that was trying to do a stopgap while this lethal injection protocol was conducted. Flash forward all the way to 2022. An independent investigation was concluded, and it found that the state had repeatedly failed to follow its own protocols in performing 7 executions and preparing for an 8th between 2018 and 2022. So there's a lot of really extensive protocols in place for doing any execution, but particularly the lethal injection, because there's a lot of room for error. We know when you're handling medicine, there's all kinds of standards around that. So the state had repeatedly failed to follow those step-by-step important guardrails to its lethal injection protocol, and that was for 7 executions and preparing for an 8th. So in 2023, Governor Bill Lee announced that they would not resume executions until the state fixed those systemic problems with the administration of its execution protocol. So we have not had a single execution since 2020 from like the investigation taking place, and then Governor Lee putting a moratorium in place due to that issues with the execution protocol. Now that importantly changed very recently. So in December of 2024, so just recently, the Tennessee Department of Corrections finalized its new lethal injection protocol. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into it. There's lots of articles that I can share with you about all the new issues with this new injection protocol, but basically the bottom line is before in this lethal injection process, they were using 2 injections, and now they're simplifying all the way down, so it's only going to be using 1 of those lethal injections, and they say it's to prevent this feeling of drowning that the combination of the 2 lethal injections were making their victims feel. So that breaks the clause in our Constitution that bans torture, cruel and unusual punishment. And so they're like, okay, well, we'll do just the 1, but there's still issues with that single lethal injection. And also they pretty much gutted the protocol altogether. So it makes it so that oh, Alice, that's a great question. Let me answer that in just a second. They basically gutted their protocol. So before there was a lot of steps that the folks had to follow of, making sure that the medicine is verified by certain doctors and that it's handled in certain ways. They basically gutted that. So instead of breaking protocol going forward, they just don't really have to adhere to any. So it's a pretty concerning new ruling. And then in March of 2025, because the Department of Corrections finalized its new protocol, the Tennessee Supreme Court ordered the execution dates be set for 4 men on death row. Pretty quickly after that ruling was set and those first 4 execution dates were set, 9 Tennessee death row prisoners filed a lawsuit challenging the new lethal injection protocol. So there's currently 9 death row prisoners, including many on the ones that have dates set. And they are being represented by lawyers who think that this new lethal injection protocol is worse than the one before, and it still qualifies as cruel and unusual torture under this new one. So crash course overview and kind of the history of Tennessee death penalty. There's a lot more nuance into it, so I can forward any resources, but that's kind of the overview. The lawsuit is just pending now. So this just happened in March and we're in May. So they're gathering all the information they need. But a pretty important part of this is that there is not anything saying that those prisoners that are on with execution dates are going to be executed before this litigation can happen. So what is needed is Governor Lee to come in and put a stay on the executions of the ones who have been ordered to death. So it's real murky because if you put to death one of the plaintiffs in a lawsuit, obviously they can't follow through with the litigation. So there's a whole lot of issue there, and folks are calling on Governor Lee. So we'll talk about that action step later. But yes, Alice said, has there ever been a painless execution, or is every execution painful despite what the authorities say? I mean, regardless, whether it's electrocution, whether it's lethal injection, there's always going to be an element of pain. Even if it's for a millisecond, there's still going to be pain. And then I would say beyond that, there's pain that lingers throughout every single community for putting one of their own to death. But Sloane, I'm sure you could have said that much more eloquently, but that's what I got for you. Okay. So looking kind of at an overview of Tennessee's executions. So as you can see, there was pretty much none until 2000, where there was one. And then 2006 and 2007, and then 2009, there was 1, 2, and 2. Then you can see there was this long time that we had without any before 2018 and 2019. This was the 7 that we had noted earlier, that folks did not follow the own protocol. And then you can see those 0 numbers from when the moratorium has been in place. So these are the folks that have execution dates set. So Oscar Smith is set to be executed next week on May 22nd, or a little after next week. Byron Black is scheduled for August 5th, Donald Middlebrooks on September 24th, and then Harold Nichols on December 11th. So these are the 4 folks whose execution dates were set. Oscar Smith has been on Tennessee's death row for over 20 years. Several of these were much, much, much younger when they first were on the death row. So this is a long time that they've been waiting, and Oscar Smith was actually taken off death row almost days before he was set to be executed. So these folks have been through it in terms of this process. Right now, 45 people are on Tennessee's death row, and there's 2,100 people nationwide facing death penalty sentences. So going a little bit more into what crimes are actually eligible for the death penalty, there is no clear-cut crime that if you commit it, you will get the death penalty, which Sloane will go into a little bit more. But these crimes are eligible for the death penalty. So it's first-degree murder with 1 or more of those following aggravated circumstances. So I won't read all of them. You can look through them, but these are what the government has determined makes murder with these things especially egregious enough to put someone to death. So can read through those if you would like. Moving on, and I can go back to that slide if y'all, or I can send them to you, but there are also mitigating factors. So this is kind of the flip side of the coin of aggravating factors. So these are circumstances that do not justify or excuse an act or offense, but they might reduce the degree of moral culpability. So they might make it a little bit less morally responsible for the things that they did, and reduce the penalty. So for example, the defender's past, say they have a difficult deprived background, or they had an issue with drug problems and they've worked on it and addressed it, all those kind of things, physical illness or disability. So these are things that reduce the culpability of the crime and might mitigate the reason someone should be put to death. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to send it in there. Sloane is a particular expert on those mitigating factors as a social worker who works in this area, so she can definitely answer even more specifically. But going over kind of the big, broad overview of capital cases, they're very complex. So this is like a 1,000-foot overview, but we're going to crash into it. So first, obviously, the alleged crime takes place. Then investigation will occur. So they're gathering evidence until they narrow in on a suspect. They'll arrest said suspect. And the court will present charges to the defendant in their arraignment, and that defendant will get to enter a plea. So whether they plead guilty or not guilty. Then a determination is made if there is a sufficient evidence to prosecute said person. So there has to be enough evidence to reasonably suspect, okay, this person might have done it, and there's enough to go through the system and go through the process. And then a grand jury presents a bill of indictment that says this specific person we think committed this specific crime. Then we'll have the hearings on pretrial motion. So these are the issues of fact or law that would be heard before the trial occurs. So saying this is what we're looking at. These are the relevant statutes, they're the relevant motions that are occurring. Huge important note here. The prosecution has to announce its intention to seek the death penalty if the defendant is found guilty before the trial. They have to say before trial occurs, we are seeking the death penalty for this defendant. They cannot go halfway through the trial and be like, you know what? I think we're going to seek the death penalty for this one. That has to be something that's determined prior to the trial taking place. And the prosecution is the ones that get to announce if they are seeking the death penalty. So that's very important and different than how a lot of our sentencing works in the criminal justice system. So once we get to actual trial, there is the jury selection, or voir dire, if you've heard that term. So both sides will get to pick and choose who they want on the jury. A lot of times it's really important in capital cases, this jury selection, especially because preconceived notions of death penalty cases are very high. So selecting the jury is very important to make sure that the folks that are being put on it are not like, I love the death penalty so much, I will always support the death penalty. They need to find people that are pretty neutral on the issue. So after they select the jury, there'll be opening statements from both sides presenting their case. Then the prosecution and defense will go further into their cases, explaining, obviously going through all the evidence, talking to witnesses, all of that. And then closing statements. So they'll make their final plea of this is why this person did or did not commit it. If you've guys seen any court dramas, you probably kind of have seen this process go, or if you've been in a courtroom yourself. Then the jury instructions take place, reminding folks what to recall, reminding them of the process. If there was things that were struck, making sure that they remember that that is not in deliberation. And once they're instructed, they'll move on to the deliberation phase. And in death penalty cases, especially, the jury must issue a unanimous verdict on the defendant's guilt and unanimously approve of the death penalty for that person. Obviously, this needs to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Super important. So once that jury has decided beyond a reasonable doubt that the person committed said crime and they're seeking the death penalty for it, the judge and jury will consider in that sentencing aggravating factors, mitigating factors, and any victim impact statements before they vote for that death sentence. So these are all really important in the process, whereas in regular cases, you see the judge really does all of this. Instead, in this circumstances, really the jury has a lot of say on it. Okay, that's a really good question. I'm gonna bump that over to Sloane in a second. Okay, so yeah, the jury must unanimously vote for a death sentence or recommend a lesser sentence of life without parole, life, or a number of years. Okay, take a deep breath. That was a lot. But basically, the underlying thing here is that capital punishment is a long and complicated process with ample room for error, as we've seen in Tennessee's history. And largely, the nation has moved away from the death penalty. But like in a lot of things, the South is lagging behind on this particular issue and still executes its citizens. So it's a lot. The process is confusing and long, but important to try to kind of conceptualize. So really quickly, I wanted to state a policy that impacts the Tennessee death penalty. HB 1663, SB 1834. This was a bill that passed last year in last year's General Assembly. And this allows for the death penalty to be applied in certain crimes that do not result in the death of the victim. So specifically, Representative Lamberth, who spearheaded this bill on the House side, noted child sexual abuse would be considered available for the death penalty. Now, you might think on the surface, okay, what's wrong with that? Well, the 2008 Kennedy v. Louisiana court case ruled that the death penalty is unconstitutional for crimes that don't result in the death of the victim. So think very literally in an eye for an eye, where if a death occurs, then a death can be sought. Can decide whether you agree with that morally or not, but that is kind of how our statute is set up, is if a death occurs, then a death can be pursued. And the sponsor of the bill, Leader Lamberth, as I stated, wants to take this to the U.S. Supreme Court. So he wants to challenge the Kennedy v. Louisiana court case. He doesn't agree with their ruling and wants them to overturn it. We've seen that as a strategy in the Tennessee Republican Party a lot recently, is they don't agree with a Supreme Court ruling, so they pass an unconstitutional bill so that they can try to appeal it all the way up to the Supreme Court and see if this conservative Supreme Court will overturn previous rulings. A lot of opponents fear that the death penalty for these crimes will have a chilling effect on those reporting if they think they'll be responsible for the death of their offender. So as we know, with particularly child sexual abuse cases, it's already extremely underreported. So if there is this extra bargaining chip that person can say, oh, well, I could get the death penalty for this, so you would literally be responsible for my death, there's a lot of likelihood for this to have a huge impact on those reporting, and more likely have an impact on them not reporting. So this was something opponents brought up a lot in this case. Fortunately, didn't seem to sway these lawmakers. There was also brought up that because the victim must still be alive in these cases, they will have to constantly come back and testify. And with the appeals process of the death penalty case, they will have to come back over and over and over again, which is extremely re-traumatizing to that victim, and having to see their offender over and over and over in court, where we see they will never really get closure because for 25, 30 years, they're going to be dealing with this case. Whereas life in prison without parole has a lot less of the appeals process, and victims will not have to keep showing up to court over and over and over. So this has not been challenged yet because it hasn't been sought yet. So once someone seeks the death penalty for a non-death of the victim crime, that's when the appealing that law will start to kick in. There will be an immediate stay on that sought penalty, and then it will go all the way through the court system. So we haven't seen it challenged yet, but the second that the state tries to use this law, or a judge tries to seek this for a crime that doesn't result in the death victim, we'll see that pop up. And I think ACLU specifically will probably pick that up along with others. So something else that's really important in policy discussions is a lot of folks, especially Leader Lamberth, when bringing this bill, stated that this will be a deterrent from people committing these crimes. Well, is the death penalty a deterrent is a really important research question in that of, okay, well, does it actually deter any folks? Short answer, no. There's no evidence that the death penalty deters folks from committing these crimes. Furthermore, you can see in these charts that the murder rate in states that have the death penalty is actually higher than the murder rate in non-death penalty states. We say that across the board. On both charts here, we see from 1995 to 2018, and then 1990 to 2010, we see that those rates are actually higher in death penalty states. And there's been no evidence that sentencing actually impacts someone's impact on doing the crime. So yeah, that's really important. And every time you hear someone say, oh, well, the death penalty deters crimes, push back, because that's not true. And there's been no evidence to suggest. There's actually been evidence to the contrary. So important. One last thing I wanted to point out that I think is really important are the racial implications of the death penalty. And Sloane's going to talk a lot more about this. But this chart kind of hits me like a punch in the gut every time. We see that the lynching of Black victims from 1883 to 1940 mirrors almost identically the locations of the executions of Black defendants in modern times. So a lot of folks compare the death penalty to just modern day lynching, and there is quite a bit of correlation between the two. So really important to keep that in mind, and Sloane's going to really talk more about that and the bias within the system. Before we move on, let's answer this question real quick. Sloane, if you want to come off mute and help me with this one. They say, does the state do anything to help the people on death row, like therapy or other types of rehab, especially with people who have had child abuse or mental health struggles?
Well, I hate to be that person to say it depends, but it really does. It depends on the jurisdiction, the prison, what state they're in, etc. So I hate to give you that vague answer, but typically what we see nationwide is psychiatric medication that's available. But in terms of therapy or any other type of rehabilitation for substance use disorders that were in the past, anything like that, I have personally not seen. And I'm not aware of any, but again, that's not to say that they're not out there. That's just me not having knowledge of every jurisdiction in the country. So sorry for the vague answer, but I hope that that answered your question a little bit. So, as Natalie said, I'm going to talk a bit about the bias within capital punishment and hope to just paint a picture of what it looks like within our communities and with the people around us to make this more of a personal issue. So, to begin, Natalie touched on this a little bit at the beginning as well, but there are no definite crimes that mandate a death sentence. So, what this looks like in practice is that two people can commit the exact same crime, yet experience two completely different outcomes. In fact, only 1 out of every 100 people that are convicted of murder are sentenced to death. So, really, you're just unlucky if that happens to you. So as you can imagine, this results in such an extensive amount of sentencing disparities that just plague our entire justice system. And it's mainly illustrated by the skin color and the economic status of the defendant, which is what I'm going to get into next. So first, I'm going to touch on how the death penalty is economically biased. And something that I like to say to explain this to people is when it comes to the death penalty, unfortunately, if you can't afford to save your life, you are more likely to lose it. So there have been some studies that have circulated this issue. Studies show that defendants with low representation costs, which means if they can't afford to hire an expensive attorney, or if they're appointed, say, a public defender or a panel attorney, pro bono attorney, things like that, they're more than 2 times as likely to be sentenced to death than those individuals who take money out of their pockets to afford an expensive attorney. And then there was a study done that was mentioned in a United States Court of Appeals case, and it was mentioned by the judge, where the judge stated that about 99% of people on death row are indigent. And indigent just means that they fall near or below the poverty line. So it's a direct correlation with the statistic I gave you beforehand. This is a quote at the bottom from a warden in New York, a warden of a prison, and it just really kind of gets me in my gut whenever I hear it. And he says, "Do you ever see a rich man go the whole route through the death house? I don't know of any." And that's true today. So next, I'm going to touch on the racial bias that is kind of infiltrated within capital punishment. So it's a pretty widely known statistic that only 13% of the United States population is Black, yet Black individuals make up 42% of people on death row at the state level and 41% of people on death row at the federal level, which is a stark disparity between the actuality of the population and then the population that makes up the capital cases. So studies have also shown, the studies that research sentencing patterns show that Black individuals are 3 to 4 times more likely to be sentenced to death compared to white individuals when they're charged with the same or similar crimes. So again, it goes back to the beginning where not every crime is sentenced to death. 2 people can commit the exact same crimes. And data shows that the Black individual is more likely to be sentenced to death, while the white individual is more likely to get life for the exact same crime. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the victims. So while white victims account for approximately 50% of all murder victims, 80% of cases that actually even face the death penalty involve white victims. So individuals are much more likely to be sentenced to death if their victim was white versus if their victim was Black or Hispanic. And then over 200 people that have been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death have been completely exonerated of their charges, which means they were completely innocent. And out of these 200 people, 65% of them were people of color, with 54% of them being Black. So far, we also know of 23 individuals who were actually innocent that did end up being executed. And that speaks for itself. I feel like nothing that I can say here is going to make that any better. It's just an uncomfortable reality that we have to sit with. But that's why we're here, to advocate for change. So another study, this is statewide now. This one is in Georgia. There was a study that showed Black individuals who killed white individuals were sentenced to death 7 times more often than white individuals who killed Black individuals, again, showing the system prioritizing white lives over Black. And then Washington State showed that individuals on the jury are 3 times more likely to recommend a death sentence for a Black defendant than for a white defendant in a similar case. This next statistic is from 2015, but I do want to note that in 2019, it remained unchanged. So as of 2015, 95% of all prosecutors in the United States were white. 79% of them were male and 16% female. I know that this was 10 years ago, but people were still sentenced 10 years ago and before that. And so people are still on death row today that were sentenced by the 95% of white prosecutors. And I think this is a huge discrepancy that also we could do a whole other presentation on that, but I think that racial representation in prosecution is going to be key to just resolving sentencing disparities based on race in general, but especially in capital punishment. Okay, so we're going to play a little game. I call it fact or fiction. Just think of an answer in your head. But the statement is the United States does not execute people with mental illness. So we can go to the next slide.
Wait, I'm doing a poll real quick. I want to see what people think.
Oh, poll?
Yeah, hold on.
I'm like not technologically savvy. I didn't know we could do that.
Okay. Let's see if this works, just for fun. Okay, can y'all see that?
Yes.
Okay, fill it out, fill it out. Mm-hmm. Got some smart people.
Beautiful.
Okay, well, on the poll. Good job.
Yay. Great. For everyone that got it right, this is fiction, unfortunately. The United States Supreme Court has said, and it's important to note, they've said that a defendant's mental illness should be taken into consideration, especially in sentencing, to be a factor in why the death penalty should be avoided. But it's important to note that there is no permanent ban to the death penalty for individuals who are mentally ill. So the statute that prevails in the United States is that we cannot execute individuals who are mentally incompetent. And many people assume that mental incompetency is the same or similar as being mentally ill, thus believing that the US doesn't execute individuals with mental illness. But that's not true. Most people with mental illness, including many with severe mental illness, are not mentally incompetent at all. And you might have also heard this is the insanity defense. It's not just for capital cases, it's for any criminal charge. You can bring an insanity defense that basically just says, I did not have any type of moral culpable state of mind because my brain's not able to get there. But that's actually extremely difficult to obtain. And most individuals, no matter how severe their mental illness is, will never actually achieve an insanity defense. That's very, very complicated. So nationwide, it is estimated that at least 20% of individuals that are currently on death row suffer from one or more severe mental illnesses. And then studies also show that, unfortunately, 43% of individuals who were executed in a 15-year span between 2000 and 2015 had been diagnosed with mental illnesses as well. So some of the most common mental illnesses among death row prisoners are bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, antisocial personality disorder, psychosis and mania, anxiety, depression, and suicidality. I do want to note that there's also developmental disabilities that I have personally seen that occur just as much or more, or just coincide with the mental illnesses. So it's not a mental illness, but developmental disabilities are very real and they're very prevalent in this population as well. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about ACEs. Anybody out here that's familiar with social work, you probably know what ACEs are, but just in case there's some people out here that don't, adverse childhood experiences is what we're going to be talking about. So if we could go to the next slide. Perfect. adverse childhood experiences, it's basically just a nuanced word for childhood trauma, but they lead to a drastic increase in the likelihood of negative mental and physical outcomes later in life, as well as destructive behavior and brain development issues. And so I'm going to go over on the next slide what ACEs actually are. There's 10 of them. And so basically, a clinician will score their patient 1 to 10. The higher it is, the more likely they are to have the negative outcomes. So we have physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and then different types of household dysfunction, such as familial mental illness, an incarcerated relative, if they witness their mother being treated violently, or father, that can go both ways, substance abuse issues, or divorce in the household. The Department of Health and Human Services estimates that about 10% of children in the United States are abused or neglected, yet that number skyrockets to be almost 40% of executed individuals that meet this criteria. Additionally, they have found that executed individuals are 13 times more likely to have been sexually abused, 13 times more likely to have been physically abused, and twice as likely to have been neglected by their caregivers. A recent study, this is out of Texas, but it shows that out of the 43 death row inmates that they studied, 94% of them were physically abused as children. 59% were sexually abused, and 83% witnessed extreme violence as children. So these ACEs, take these independent of the developmental disabilities, take these independent of the mental illness. These things alone for a child to experience as their brain is developing, for these things to be the norm, it gives a lot of context as to how individuals can end up facing the death penalty. It's not an excuse, but it is a lot of background. It's very important to know, especially as the state is looking to take somebody's life away. It's important to look at not what they did to get there, but also how they got there in the first place. So we're going to talk about the cost of capital punishment, another little game. I'm sure you're all going to get this one right as well. Oh, there we go. Look at that poll. Okay, fact or fiction again. The question or the statement is, it is cheaper to execute someone than it is for taxpayers to have to pay for someone to spend their life in prison. And this one does get more people. I've actually heard most people say that this is fact. I've never really had people say this is fiction, so I'm curious to see what everybody says.
Yeah, we got 4 out of 7 people, so that's majority. Oh,
okay. We got a mix of both. We got a mix of fact and fiction. Ta-da! This is also fiction. So more than a dozen states that have studied this issue have found that just litigating one single capital case through the court system costs 10 times more when compared to litigating non-death penalty cases. Because the death penalty process is more expensive in general because it's largely more complicated. Someone's life is quite literally on the line. So there's going to be more attorneys, more trial fees, witnesses, appeals, experts, motions, all the things. So this equates to exorbitant costs before an appeal is even filed, not to mention the 30 years of appeals that are likely to result. So, for example, there was a study in California that showed that taxpayers spent on average $117 million per year seeking the execution of the people currently on death row, a number that amounts over time to $4 billion more than if the state would have spent if these inmates had been sentenced to life without parole instead. So there was another study coming out of Maryland. It was the most rigorous cost study in the country. It showed that a single death sentence cost almost $2 million more than a non-death penalty case. Before ending the death penalty, Maryland spent $186 million extra to carry out just 5 executions. 5. As Sterling Godspeed, he was a former district attorney in New York. He stated this, and I like this quote a lot, so I put it in there. He says that, "I think I could prove to you that I could put someone in the Waldorf Hotel for 60 to 70 years and feed them 3 meals a day, cheaper than we can litigate a single death penalty case." So, a really common thing that I have heard, especially being from Tennessee, I'm sure if you've ever talked about this with people, you've probably heard the same, that it is much cheaper to execute and kill someone. That way, we don't have to keep them in our system and, pay for their meals, life in prison without parole. But that is just so abundantly not true. And yeah, there's really no argument with that. This is another thing that I just wanted to make clear as I begin to wrap up here. I just believe that everyone is worth more than the worst thing they've ever done. Again, that is not me sitting here making excuses for these crimes or for the innocent victims whose lives were tragically lost. I do think that mercy goes a really long way. I think understanding and I think empathy goes a really long way. And at the end of the day, I also don't think that it's constitutional for a state or for the federal government to take the lives of its own citizens. I think capital punishment in and of itself is cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment, and that's my stance on that. So we're just going to play a quick little video. This is from Brian Stevenson. If you're familiar with him, great. If you're not, you really should be. He's fascinating. He's amazing. And he has done some of the most brilliant litigation in the death penalty world. And he is somebody that, if you're interested in this topic, you should really a little bit further into. So we're going to play just a short 3-minute video.
Punishment in this country. I don't think the question of capital punishment in this country can be answered by asking, do people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed? I think the threshold question is, do we deserve to kill? For every 10 people we've executed in this country, we've now identified an innocent person who's been released. It's a shocking rate of error. We would not accept that kind of error in many areas of life. If for every 10 apples, one would cause you to die if you bit into it, if that were the case, we'd stop eating apples. We would not allow supermarkets and grocers to sell things that were this lethal, and yet our justice system continues to tolerate these horrific error rates. I represented a man named Anthony Ray Hinton who spent nearly 30 years on death row for a crime he did not commit. He was wrongly accused, unfairly accused, taken to trial, and because he was poor and couldn't get the expert assistance he needed to prove his innocence, he was convicted and sentenced to death. We don't provide lawyers to people on death row in many states. There is no right to counsel for death row prisoners. So we have hundreds of people unable to get the legal assistance they need. And so Mr. Hinton spent 15 years languishing on death row without the help he needed. We got involved in his case in 1999, and we were able to show very quickly that he was innocent. The gun that they claimed had been used in 2 murders and matched to bullets recovered from those murders, the best experts in the country said did not match. And when we presented that evidence to courts, instead of recognizing his innocence, they looked the other way. They decided to proclaim that the evidence wasn't going to be reviewed. We used proceduralism to shield review of that case. And for the next 15 years, we had to fight before the United States Supreme Court finally overturned his case, ordered a new trial, and at the new trial the state was required to do the testing that proved his innocence, that resulted in his release. The death penalty should be abolished. We believe that we can do better than condemn people to die in systems that are as unfair and unreliable as ours. And our work representing death row prisoners, challenging excessive punishment more broadly, continues. And we really won't stop until we see reform.
All right. Sloane, do you want to kind of add a concluding before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of what I said before. Just, my heart really does go out to individuals who are sentenced to death. Like I said, not excusing the behavior, but really just showing mercy and giving value to every human life and giving people the dignity that they deserve, especially those who really have, spent 20, 30, even 5 years in there and have devoted themselves to becoming better, maybe working through their trauma, understanding their illnesses, being medicated for the first time in their life. They have access to medication. And I don't think people should be punished for doing things that I don't think people should be put to death for doing things that they wouldn't have done if they were afforded the luxury and the privilege of medication and a sound mind. So I thank you all for listening to me and for listening to Natalie. And I know she has a couple things before we wrap up.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sloane. As you guys can tell, she has a humongous heart, and I'm honored to call her my bestie. But quick shout out to other orgs. Biggest org that's working on this stuff in Tennessee is Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. So I'm going to drop some links in the chat. I know the sharing is paused, but I can't really do this otherwise. So if you want to just check out their website, this is their website. And then really importantly is this sign-on letter, opening it so you can see it. So this is a letter to Governor Lee, urging him not to resume the executions. It kind of goes over briefly what I said earlier about the new lethal injection protocol. So this is a highlight on that. And it says that there are execution dates set, and this is just urging Governor Lee to resume executions. He's really the only person that can pause these executions besides President Donald Trump. So we can assume that that's not going to happen. So definitely, if you feel called to, sign this action letter, share it with your friends. This is really important. The more he hears from folks about this issue, the more likely he is that he's going to take action on it. He's done the right thing once before. So, a little push might help to show him, yes, you have support behind you. Don't resume these executions under this new protocol. So that's that one. You can also support Sloane's work at Portrait of a Prisoner. Sloane, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So Portrait of a Prisoner is a nonprofit that I founded almost 2 years ago now. It's crazy. But I really just wanted to highlight the stories of individuals who are incarcerated and give them a platform to share who they are. Because I think, like I said, mercy is key, whether you're sentenced to death or if you're in prison for 6 months. I think everybody deserves a platform to share their story and who they are. And especially when they are shut off from society in ways that a lot of them don't deserve, whether it's excessive sentencing disparities, or innocence. I think everybody deserves that right. And I think that it can help with policy reform and things like this, even the abolition of the death penalty. When people look at these individuals that are incarcerated, not as just numbers and statistics, but as human beings with real stories. So that's what I do. And we've been on a little hiatus for about 6 months. We used to do exclusively posting on Instagram and on our website. But as we got more and more stories sent in to us from different individuals all over the country, a lot of them were getting longer. And I just felt like maybe I wanted to do something different. So I've been thinking about publishing a book with individual stories that I'm going to partner with. So be on the lookout for that. And I'll post on the Instagram with any updates.
Amazing. It's a real if you do have time, look through that Instagram, read some of the stories. They're really, really, really powerful. Some poetry that some of these individuals have wrote that bring me to tears every time. So definitely check out Sloane's work, and I'll definitely share out in an email later if she publishes a book with these stories, because that's awesome. Also, just kind of like a last thing, if you have the means and are able to do so, please consider donating to Awake to allow us to continue offering free community trainings to the public. These are really important for us to educate and advocate, but this is hard work and we need money to do it. So if you feel so called, this is the link. It's just awaketn.org/give. If you can't right now, that's okay. Save that link, use it later. We also have a monthly donor program called the Advocates Society. So that you can donate as little as like $5 a month. But yeah, thank you so much. Here is just one more event to plug. We are doing a legislative wrap up. So this is kind of like a party celebrating all of Awake's work. We passed a bill this year, the Fertility Care and Contraceptive Protection Act. So we're just going to be celebrating that win, honoring some amazing advocates, and just being together in community after a hard, arduous session. So if that's something you're interested in joining, I'm going to send the link in the chat. And yeah, thank you so much, y'all. I really appreciate you showing up. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So if you've got any questions, throw them in the Q&A. And if not, we can hop off early. So we'll sit and see if y'all have any questions. Sloane, I think we might be the best hosts ever. I have no questions. We just covered it all.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Okay, well, if y'all come up with any questions, feel free to email me and I'll get something back to you. But thank you so much for joining. I'm going to stick around for the next 5 minutes.